We continue to be looking at one of Jesus' last teaching times with his disciples before he heads to Jerusalem and the cross. Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 15. It says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence or two or three witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything that they ask, it will be done for you by the Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among you." And Peter came up and said to him, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one of them was brought to him who owed 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and his children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, 'Pay what you owe me.' So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will repay you.' He refused, and he went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and they reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?' And his anger, the master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all of his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." There you go. Every once in a while, something just kind of sticks with me a little longer than maybe it should be. One example of this was last month when we were on vacation at the happiest place on earth at Disney World. Now, one of the things that happens at Disney World is lots of buses that take you from one place to another, and usually you don't have to wait very long for one of these buses, but for whatever reason, we got to one of the bus stops, and the bus must have just left, and the second bus that was coming had made a stop in Montana. So it was a little delayed getting there, and so it was the end of the day, and it started getting long, and there was a line forming behind us, and there's probably 50 or 60 people trying to get on a bus that seats about 40 people, and so that's happening, and it's getting a longer and longer time. The bus finally arrives, and the bus loading process at Disney World is very simple. There's 2 entryways into the bus. There's a back door that they've got set up with a ramp for folks that have got scooters and wheelchairs and need special assistance going in. They get to be loaded on first, and then everyone else goes in the front door. Now, we're toward the front of the line because we've been waiting for this bus for 3.5 days, and so we've been up there toward that, and we're waiting, and we're ready to get on the bus. And so they load the people toward the back, and sometimes maybe if you're traveling with somebody that's got a wheelchair or a scooter, you go on the back side as well. And so they get loaded in, and then by the time we get loaded into the front, the person that was with the person with the scooter or the wheelchair has sat down down on the row and taken several bags, all of their belongings, and like a second grader said, I save all of these seats while all of these people are coming in. Now, I don't know why that is, but that bugged the snot out of me. The idea that they're just, we're going to just save all of these seats for all of our friends that are in the back of the line. And I'll tell you that for 2 or 3 days on vacation at the happiest place on earth, I'd look at Susan and say, you remember that person on the bus saving all of those seats? And it would make me mad every single time that I thought about it. Does something like that ever happen to anyone else? Well, I know it happens to some other people who live in my house. I know it happens to them because we have a family story that we simply call Remember the Lady in South Carolina. Now, I told Susan we were going to tell the story about Remember the Lady in South Carolina. It happened more than 20 years ago, and I told her, I said, I don't even remember what that lady did. I just remember that we were traveling, we were on a trip, we stopped at a gas station, and that lady in the parking lot of the gas station did something that made us mad, and we drove for miles saying, can you believe that lady? And so ever since then, we talk about, you remember the lady in South Carolina? Here's the truth. I don't remember the lady in South Carolina. I just remember we were mad at her. I have no idea what she did. I told Susan, I said, I'm going to tell the story about the lady in South Carolina. I said, chuckle, chuckle, chuckle. I don't even remember what she did. Susan does. And she gave me the list. She said, well, she did this, she did this, she did this. Like, oh yeah, we are mad at the lady from South Carolina. You all understand what it's like to be mad and to be upset about those kinds of things. Matthew chapter 18, Jesus begins to teach about how we deal with people that we're upset with. He begins to talk about what we deal with people that we're frustrated with and we're angry with. In fact, if you begin here in chapter 18, beginning in verse 15, what you see is this is what you do when you have a brother who has offended you and sinned against you. And it gives us a pattern, which is a great pattern for our lives today. It talks about the fact that if you have someone who has sinned against you, if you have someone that you have beef with, that you have difficulty with, here's what you do. You get on Twitter. You get on Facebook. No, it's not what you do. You go and you talk to that person. Crazy idea. Crazy idea. But if you've got an issue with someone, if there's conflict with one person, you go and talk to that person. The goal of that conversation is reconciliation. The goal of that conversation is restoring that relationship. If you go and talk to that person one-on-one and it doesn't go well, because reconciliation matters so much, you go back again and you take some people with you. Now, understanding that when you go and you take some people with you, they are there to listen, to hear, and to evaluate what is happening. Keep in mind that when you go to that person and bring them, you know what they might do? They might say, Tim, you know what? The other person's right. You're the one that's wrong in this place. And so when we go there, it is for reconciliation. And the passage of Scripture tells us one more step. It says that even if they won't be reconciled after you talk to them one-on-one, even if you won't be reconciled after you bring a couple of people with them, it says, listen, take them to the assembly, take them to the church. And then if they won't be reconciled, then you say you have to treat them as either a tax collector or a Gentile. Now we'll unpack that in just a few moments, but I want you to keep in mind that before you get too concerned about someone being called a tax collector, particularly if anyone here works for the federal government. But before you get too concerned about someone being called a tax collector, notice who's writing down this story. It is Matthew, who was, there you go, you got it on the first try. He was a tax collector, so he understands exactly the context of what this is. But as we look at this long passage, what I want to draw your attention to is what I believe is the center of this passage. And the center of this passage is this question: do we really have to forgive others? Do we really have to forgive others? Now, several of you are nodding your head yes. The 8:30 service not only nodded their head yes, they said yes, and we just shut down the service and went home. They already got it on the first time. We left early. But the answer to this question is yes, but it gets unpacked a little bit further, because now we ask the question, okay, I know that I'm supposed to forgive. But what happens is that we're more likely to forgive like little stuff. Like somebody saving seats on the bus at Disney or whatever happened in that parking lot in South Carolina. Little things that aren't really that important. But what about big things? And what about stuff that happens more than once? How often do I have to forgive somebody? You know, we kind of have a phrase that we like to use, and I always get this thing mixed up. But it says, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Unpack that basically says, I'm going to give you one shot, and I'm going to forgive you once. But after that, I'm done forgiving. I'm done with that. We are even after that, and I'm not putting up with it anymore. Now, the rabbis had thought about this in Jesus' day, and they had tried to unpack this question because it still remains a pretty great question. Do I really have to forgive? How often do I have to forgive? They understood that shame me once was a little bit short on grace. And so what they had determined after consultation and discussions and committee meetings and all kinds of things like that, they had determined that forgiveness, if you were a follower of God, you needed to forgive somebody 3 times. 3 times. Now, assuming that this is maybe the same issue, 3 times you do somebody wrong, once, twice, 3, I'll forgive you 3 times. Now, notice in this passage, it's one of those moments where Peter wants to show off a little bit. And Peter steps forward and says, man, all this forgiving stuff, how often am I supposed to forgive people? Am I supposed to forgive people as many as 7 times? Now, I think at this point in time, Peter really felt like, man, the rabbis have been saying 3 times. I'm going to say up to 7 times. Now, I noticed that there's he's got like a lawyer tendency. He says up to 7 times. It doesn't have to be 7 times. It'll be as, different circumstances will require different things. But Peter says, listen, it is possible that I am willing to forgive somebody 7 times. Now, keep in mind, this may be 7 times of the same thing. This may be 7 things, not just saving seats on the bus, but this might be something deep, harmful, hurtful that has crushed your soul. And Peter says, under the right circumstances, I'll forgive 7 times. And he looks at Jesus and says, high five, right? And Jesus says, it's not 7. My translation here says it's 77 times. Some of your translations might say it's 70 times 7. So it's not 1, it's not 3, it's not 7. Maybe it's 77. Maybe it's 490 times. Now, what's unpacking here, what's unfolding here at this point in time, that Jesus isn't really asking you to get a good journal to write these things down. What he is doing is by pulling these things together, by talking about the 7s and talking about the 10s and shoving them together, he is basically doing what we did back when we were kids and said, and when we were losing an argument, we would just say, oh yeah, well, infinity. Jesus is stacking all of these numbers up, and he's saying, when it comes to forgiveness, infinity's the answer. Because here's the truth. If you're counting, you're not really forgiving. If you look at somebody and say, that's twice, does that feel like you're being forgiven? No, it feels like someone is counting score. It seems like someone is waiting to be unleashed. I will wait for you to do this 3 times, 7 times. You know what? Peter said, okay, 77. I'll write that down. Judas is already on 11. I got that in my head. I know if you're counting, you're not forgiving. This is one of those places where Jesus surprises us. Man, Peter said 7. I'll go up to 7. Jesus says, try infinity. And we're like, man. Again, there's little stuff. There's stuff that doesn't matter. There's stuff that's more of a nuisance and an annoyance. But Jesus, you don't understand. When I start thinking about forgive, I'm talking about people who have harmed me, who have wounded me, who have changed my life in a negative way. People for whom the things that they did to me, I have yet to recover. Jesus said, I know. I know. And he hasn't changed his answer. Now we're going to unpack this for a few minutes together. And we're going to talk about forgiveness from Jesus' perspective. And the truth of the matter is that when we're talking about bus seats, just get over it, right? But when we're talking about deep things, this gets much more difficult. And I want to just have an awareness that as we gather together by the dozens and by the hundreds this morning, that I know that there are things that are represented in this room that are deep, deep wounds. Some of them that are attached to deep darkness. And I don't want to minimize that in any way. But in the same way, I can't minimize what Jesus says. So let's pull these together in the reality of our lives and see if we can understand what Jesus has to say. Now, I do have one quick question in this passage. I'm trying to figure out a little bit who brought up forgiveness. Remember, we talked about those opening verses of the passage today, and it was talking about if you've got a brother against you and you go and talk to them one-on-one, and then you take a couple people with them, and then you take them to the church. I think that there's a lot of times that we look at that passage and we interpret that as this is the way that we punish people inside of church. That if someone does something wrong, you talk to them one-on-one, you bring a couple people with them, they take them before the whole church, and then they're punished as a church. I'm going to tell you, I don't believe that that's the best understanding of this passage. See, this passage says, if your brother has sinned against you, not against the church. This is interpersonal. I want you to know that every time that this passage talks about you, it is singular you. You go talk to you. If that person, it is interpersonal. And here's how it ends. It says that if they will not respond to the witness of the assembly of the church, then you are to treat them as a tax collector or a Gentile. I don't believe that that's a punishment as much as saying, listen, you don't associate with tax collectors and Gentiles. In the same way, if you cannot reach resolution, reconciliation, if you cannot reach that, then you need to just move on. You need to let it go. And that's when Peter comes up and says, wait, how many times is a brother going to sin against me? And I go through the whole list, and then I'm supposed to just let them go? He says they're getting away with it. How many times? Okay, I'll do that, but 7's my limit. 7's my limit. I won't go past 7. And Jesus says, man, I'm telling you, till you stop counting, you haven't begun forgiving. And he says, let me tell you a story. Now this story, man, just reading it kind of knocked our socks off, didn't it? There's a king. He's going through the books. I don't know if it's tax season. I don't know if he's trying to buy a new home. I don't know what he's doing, but he's going through the books. And he's checking the number of things that are outstanding debts in his accounting book. And he finds this one guy that owes a crazy amount of money. And I understand, the numbers that are here in the text are not numbers that we use all the time. Denarii and talents and all those kinds of things. But here's what I want you to understand. This guy owes the king, did I say crazy money? Crazy money. Let me help you with the math a little bit. A denarius, or multiple denarii, is what you earn in one day. If you were to work for 50 years, save everything that you earn, you would accumulate 15,000 denarii. I think pretty good. I mean, like that would be a good number to win in a grand prize at McDonald's and the Monopoly board. You won 50 years of salary. 15,000 cold denarii. That's pretty good. So, what's 10,000 talents? 10,000 talents is 60 million denarii. I don't do the math real well. What is that, 400 lifetimes? That's how much money he owed. Now, when Jesus tells the story, Jesus likes to tell stories that make you chuckle. He tells stories about speck in your eye will get the log out of your eye first. That's a funny story. He says, this guy owes some money. Well, how much money does he owe? 10,000 talents. What? That's crazy money. And then Jesus adds one more punchline. When the king comes and says, pay up, the servant falls on his knees and says, give me a little bit more time. I'll pay it all back. Now, I got to tell you, I think people were spitting drinks out of their nose at that point in time. The idea that the servant would look with a straight face and say, I'll pay it all back. I'll give you 400 lifetimes of salary as soon as I go home and check my couch cushions or whatever it is. But what Jesus gives in that moment tells the story of incredible grace. You see, the king doesn't renegotiate that loan. The king doesn't put amnesty on that loan. He does not suspend payment on that loan. He doesn't discount that loan. He looks at the guy and says, it is all forgiven. Now, I think if you and I were doing that, we'd say, well, you know what? You got to pay me back something. You got to give me something. But the man is told that every ounce, every cent, every scrap of that debt is forgiven and gone. It's amazing. What a great story if it had ended there. We get the impression that it's almost straight from that encounter that the servant walks out the door, finds some dude that owes him money, and puts his hands around his neck and says, you got to pay me back. Now, I need to point out that sometimes when we read this passage and we run through this and we understand 10,000 talents is a lot of money, we assume that the amount that the second servant owes is just, it's change. But at 100 denarii, that's a third of a year's salary. That's thousands of dollars. That's a legitimate debt. But Jesus' message is, it is offensive to receive forgiveness on this level and receive grace at this level and never extend grace to anybody else. In fact, he says that if you behave in that way with the forgiveness that you've received, then you will lose the forgiveness that you have. Let's try to unfold that a little bit more. Let me try to come to some conclusions with that. The first thing I want you to understand about this, that this teaches us, is that satisfaction is out of reach. You know, one of the reasons why we don't want to forgive, because we're planning on getting even. Isn't that the plan? I won't forgive until I know that the harm that you gave, that you have received an equal amount of harm. You've harmed me this much, I want you to get paid back this much. We want that in the legal system. We want that in interpersonal relationships. We want you to feel the exact same amount of pain that I felt. Now listen, some of you are carrying pain. Some of you are carrying hurt that you could spend an entire lifetime planning, dreaming, daydreaming, orchestrating, and you're never going to be able to get payback on that. Even our legal system, the best legal system in the world, often fails to give satisfaction. The crime and the punishment almost never weighs, and it never can really impact the heart where the pain really was. The flip side of that is most of us will never be able to get retribution for what we want. But every once in a while, we'll have an opportunity where actually we can slam the person that we've been wanting to get back to forever. And you know what happens in those cases? Our anger has built up so much that we overshoot. And so therefore, we've inflicted more pain than what we received. This is why Jesus says, this is why God says, vengeance is mine. He's not breathing threats. He's just saying, listen, I'll take care of this. You don't have the ability to take care of this. Justice is a precision game. You are not a precision person. You don't have access to getting even in this way. And so one of the reasons why forgiveness matters is because satisfaction is outside of our reach. And if you are holding on to some anger, some bitterness, some hurt, some wound, some soul-crushing experience because you're saying, I'm going to hold on to this till I get satisfaction, it's not going to happen. It's outside of our reach. I also want you to know that forgiveness does not mean vulnerability. Forgiveness does not mean vulnerability. I want you to notice that when we are obedient and we let the work of the Spirit of God that Jesus tells us about, when we allow that to happen inside of our lives, that does not mean that we leave ourselves in dangerous and vulnerable places. If we go back to the context of all of Matthew 18, remember one of the things he's been concerned about is making sure that these little ones are protected. And so there is no equating forgiveness with leaving yourself in physical, spiritual, or emotional harm. That's not ever what God intended for our lives in that way. He never intended for us to be put into that place where we continue to be dangerous. I want you to notice that the king forgives this debt, but he doesn't co-sign on another loan. He doesn't keep handing out money. He forgives. But that doesn't mean he has to continue to keep co-signing loans for this guy. I want you to know that just because you forgive doesn't mean you have to continue to live in a vulnerable and dangerous circumstance, emotionally, spiritually, physically, none of those things. Forgiveness means I've handed it over to God. I've moved myself to a safe place, but I'm no longer going to be the person who exacts satisfaction or vengeance in the story. The third thing is that grace to me must become grace to others. Grace to me must become grace to others. It's like there's a missing verse in this story. There's verse 27, and then there's verse 28. In verse 27, he is forgiven. And in verse 28, he's choking the next guy. But you know what's missing is the verse where he falls on his knees and says, thank you for the forgiveness that you've given me. Thank you for rescuing my life. Thank you for saving my family. Thank you for bailing me out. of a debt that I could never, ever pay. You have changed my life, and I will ever be grateful to you. It's missing. And I think it's because it's missing in the story. It's missing when he interacts with a servant. But man, I wonder how many times that verse is missing in my life as well. The number of times that Jesus has forgiven me and I brush it off as though it's no big deal. He rescued me from being dead in my sin. And I've been forgiven in that way. How can I be an unforgiving person? He has forgiven me everything that I've ever done. He's forgiven me everything that I've not done. He's forgiven me everything that I've said. He's forgiven me everything that I've thought. And he's done the same for you. He has forgiven you 60 million denarii, crazy amounts of sin. And it is an offense to the God who died for our sins that we would be a forgiven person who refused to forgive. Let's think about the now what. Really, 3 ways that you can respond this morning. The first one is that you can receive forgiveness. Don't miss the headline in this story. Jesus is the King who forgives ridiculous amounts of sin. He is the King who forgives all sin. And if you come in this morning and you say, I'm here in church, but I'm never quite here because I don't belong here, because I have too much sin. He forgives the craziest amounts of sin. And you can never come to him and say, my sin is too large. As we sang this morning, his mercy is more. And so the first thing that you can do in a response this morning is that you can receive that forgiveness. The second thing that you can do this morning is that you can celebrate that forgiveness. Man, make sure that that verse isn't skipped in your life. Man, he forgave you of what you did this week, what you said this morning, what you did a decade ago. He forgave all of that. Have you forgotten what he has forgiven you of? Will you be afresh in your celebration of that forgiveness? And then here's the heavy one. Receive forgiveness, celebrate forgiveness. You can feel it coming, can't you? Will you extend forgiveness? If I were to ask, is there anyone here today that's got someone in their life that they just feel like they can't forgive? There'd be hardly a person here who didn't respond to that. Now you may say, but you don't know what they did. I don't. But I know what Jesus said. You may say, but they've done it a bunch of times. But I know what Jesus said. You may say, but they don't deserve it. That's kind of the point of forgiveness. We only forgive people who don't deserve. So right where you are this morning, I want you to think about those 3 things and just determine which is the one that you need most in your life today. To receive forgiveness, to celebrate forgiveness, to extend forgiveness. Maybe if you've even got your pen and making notes this morning, just mark down on your piece of paper, on your bulletin, 1, I need to receive it. 2, I need to celebrate it anew. 3, I need to extend it to somebody else. Which one of those is the most significant thing that God is putting on your heart right now? In a moment, I'm going to pray. And I want you to process what the Spirit of God says inside of you. But we're going to open up the steps in our time of response. Man, just have a time with Him here. Say, I heard you, God. I didn't want to hear you, but I heard you. If we can pray for you, we will. But really, we just want to give you the opportunity to stand, come at the steps, and say, I heard you, God. I heard you. Let me pray. We're going to sing, and I invite you to respond.